All right, so music, right? Halal or haram? It's the question that's been echoing through the Ummah for centuries, and guess what? We still don't have one easy answer.
It really is remarkable, isn't it? You'd think, with all the sources we have, the Quran, Hadith, scholarly opinions, there'd be more clarity.
Right. But that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. We're not searching for the answer. We're going to unpack the arguments, both sides, and see what we can learn from them. Because, let's be real, this isn't just some theoretical debate. It affects how Muslims live their lives.
Exactly. The music they listen to, the instruments they play, even how they celebrate, it all ties back to this question of what's permissible. So getting a grasp on the arguments, well, it helps us understand the nuances, the gray areas. It helps us make informed choices.
Exactly. So where do we even begin with something this complex? I guess the Quran, right?
Yeah.
That's the foundation.
Absolutely. Always a good starting point. But even there, it's not as straightforward as you might think. There's no verse that just comes right out and says music is forbidden, but
there are verses that some people interpret that way, right? I mean, I've heard that one from Surah Luqman, verse 6, brought up a lot. Something about idle talk and turning people away from Allah.
That's the one. And right away, we see how interpretation plays a huge role here. You have major figures from the early Islamic period like Ibn Masud and Ibn Abbas. These were respected guys, and they both linked idle talk to music specifically. Their views are even recorded in Tafsir al-Tabari, which is like the gold standard for Quranic commentary.
So we're talking arguments against music going all the way back to the Prophet's time. Wow.
Pretty much, yeah. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Is idle talk only about music? Could it be broader than that? I mean, think about it. Any kind of chatter or activity that distracts us from Allah could fit that description.
Oh, I see what you're saying. The Arabic word itself, it doesn't necessarily single out music, right?
Yeah.
So even within the Quran, there's room for different ways of understanding this.
Exactly. And then you have another verse from Surah Al-Isra, verse 64, that gets brought into this discussion. This one mentions your voice, and some scholars interpret that as the tempting musical influence of Satan.
Whoa, okay, so now we've gone from idle chatter to satanic music. That escalated quickly.
Well, it reflects a deep concern about the power music can have, right? The potential to lead people astray. But again, you could also argue that your voice could refer to any kind of temptation, not just the musical kind.
Okay, so two verses, two different surahs, both kind of connected to music, but also open to different interpretations. Where do we go from here?
Well, to dig a little deeper, we have to look at the Hadiths, the collections of sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. And that's where things get really fascinating.
Bring on the Hadiths. What kind of musical wisdom did the Prophet drop?
Well, one of the most powerful arguments against music comes from a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari. Now, Sahih al-Bukhari is considered one of the most authentic hadith collections, so when it says something, people listen. And this hadith, it straight up lists musical instruments right there with major sins like adultery and drinking.
Whoa, okay, so if Sahih al-Bukhari says it's bad, you know it's serious. No wonder that hadith carries so much weight.
Right, it's not something to be taken lightly. But here's the thing. There are also hadiths that paint a more permissive picture.
Oh, so now we're getting to the good stuff. Give me an example.
All right, so there's this hadith, also from Sahih al-Bukhari, about two girls singing during Eid. The Prophet doesn't just allow it, he actually sits there and listens.
Wait, hold up. So one hadith says music's like a major sin, and another one says it's okay during Eid celebrations.
Yep.
How do we reconcile that?
It seems to point to the idea that context really matters. The type of music, the occasion, the intention behind it all. These things seem to play a role in whether or not it's considered permissible.
So we can't just take one hadith and run with it. We got to look at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. Any other hadiths we should consider before we move on?
Well, there's one more that's kind of, well, it's intense. It's from Sunan ibn Majah, and it connects music with divine punishment. Like, a group of people are enjoying music, and suddenly, bam! The earth swallows them up, and they're turned into animals.
Okay, that one's a bit much.
Yeah.
Makes you think twice about what's on your playlist.
Yeah.
Maybe before we go down that rabbit hole, though, let's step back. What was the actual reality during the Prophet's time? Did people actually play music, and if so, how did he react?
That's a great question, because it helps us see how these teachings were applied, in everyday life. And we do have historical accounts that give us some insight.
Oh, lay it on me. Give me the historical tea.
All right, so there's this hadith in Sahih Muslim where the Prophet is watching Abyssinian dancers performing in the mosque. And not only does he allow it, he even lets his young wife Aisha watch too.
Hold on, the Prophet was cool with people dancing in the mosque. That doesn't sound like a total ban on music to me.
Right. It suggests that some forms of music or dance, especially those tied to cultural expression or just harmless fun, were probably considered acceptable. But we got to remember, pre-Islamic Arabia was a different world. Music was often intertwined with practices that Islam aimed to change, like idolatry, excess, those kinds of things.
So it's like on one hand you have the Prophet watching dancers in the mosque, and on the other you have music linked to stuff Islam was trying to move away from. It's a puzzle. All these seemingly contradictory pieces.
That's the beauty of it. It's not black and white. It's about understanding all this evidence, the historical context, the different interpretations. And you know what? We've only just scratched the surface.
Wait, there's more.
Oh yeah. Next, we're going to delve into the minds of some of the greatest Islamic scholars throughout history. Let's see what they had to say about music.
All right, bring on the scholarly heavyweights. Let's see what wisdom they've got.
All right, so we're stepping into the world of Islamic scholarship now, ready to see how some of the greatest minds grappled with this whole music question. And where better to start than with the heavy hitters, the big four imams of Sunni Islam. We're talking Abu Hanifa, Malik, Al-Shafi'i, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal. These were the giants, the ones who laid down the foundations of Islamic law.
Okay, so what did these titans of Islamic thought think about music? Were they all on the same page, or did they have different opinions?
Well, like most things in Islamic scholarship, it's not that simple. Imam Abu Hanifa, for example, he was known for his emphasis on reason and analogy. He generally considered music disliked, mainly because of its potential to distract from religious duties. It was all about priorities for him.
Makes sense. If music's taking precedence over prayer or remembering God, yeah, you gotta check yourself. So what about Imam Malik? He was the scholar from Medina, right? The one who compiled one of the earliest collections of Hadith. Did he see eye to eye with Abu Hanifa on this?
Imam Malik was super strict, very much about sticking to the letter of the law, following the practices of the early Muslim community in Medina. And for him, music, yeah, he was not a fan. He even considered people who were into music as foolish. His rulings were heavily based on those hadiths that seemed to condemn music, and he didn't really budge on that.
So if you're not both leaning towards no music, what about Imam al-Shafi'i? Wasn't he known as the master of legal methodology? Did he bring anything new to the table?
Al-Shafi'i, yeah, he was all about that systematic approach to Islamic law. And guess what? He also linked music with sinful stuff, emphasizing how it could lead to moral corruption and all that. It was a slippery slope for him. His position was similar to Imam Malik's, relying a lot on those cautionary hadiths we talked about.
Okay, so 3 out of the 4 imams are saying no to music. Was there anyone in this legal dream team who had a different take?
But now we get to Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. He was the champion of traditionalism, known for his massive collection of hadiths. He was a bit more nuanced, so while he generally considered musical instruments haram, he actually made an exception for the duff.
The duff? What's that?
It's like a frame drum or tambourine, and he allowed it, especially during celebrations like weddings and festivals.
Interesting. So a little bit of wiggle room there. Duff is okay. Everything else is off limits. It seems like these early scholars were pretty united in their disapproval of music. But did that view stay consistent over time?
That's where things get even more interesting. As Islamic thought developed, you have other scholars coming in with alternative interpretations. One of the most influential was Imam al-Ghazali, the one who wrote Ya Ulam al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences.
Al-Ghazali, the rock star of Islamic scholarship. I'm dying to hear what he thought about music. Did he side with the big four or shake things up?
Al-Ghazali was deep, man. He really understood spirituality, and he took a different approach, focusing more on the impact music had on the heart, the spirit. He said music and singing could be okay, even encouraged if they inspired you to do good, think good thoughts, and feel a closer connection to God.
So wait, he's saying a song that makes you feel closer to God is actually a good thing. That's a huge difference from the music is bad vibe we've been getting so far.
Yeah, and his views were super influential, especially among Sufis. They often incorporate music and chanting into their spiritual practices, Al-Ghazali's perspective really added a whole new layer to the debate. It wasn't just about the music itself anymore. It was about the intention behind it, the effect it had on you.
Okay, so we've gone from strict no music to it depends with Al-Ghazali. Were there any other scholars who went even further, like full-on challenged the traditional view?
Oh yeah, there was Ibn Hazm. a super smart Andalusian scholar. He was known for being independent, not afraid to go against the grain. And he straight up said that there's no solid evidence in the Quran or Hadith to ban all music. He even argued that a lot of the Hadiths people used to justify the ban were either weak or could be interpreted differently.
Wow, Ibn Hazm was out there pushing boundaries. No solid evidence, huh? That must have caused some serious debate back in the day.
Oh, you know it. But it just shows you that there's always been a diversity of thought within Islamic scholarship. And that diversity, well, it continues to this day.
So what about contemporary scholars? Where do they stand on this whole music debate? Have we reached some kind of agreement in the 21st century?
Not quite. There's still no universal answer, even today. But we do have prominent scholars offering interpretations that try to make sense of music in the modern world. Guys like Yusuf al-Qaradawi and Amjad Rashid, both well-respected in Islamic jurisprudence and ethics. They've both said things that are more lenient than the traditional stance.
Interesting. So what are they saying? What kind of music gets the thumbs up in the 21st century?
Content is key for them. Music that promotes good morals, positive social values, that's generally considered okay. They also recognize that music can be powerful, for education, for emotional well-being, even for spiritual growth.
So it's not about banning music altogether. It's about being aware of what we're listening to and how it affects us.
Yeah.
That seems way more realistic than just saying all music is bad, especially in today's world where it's everywhere.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really crucial point in this whole discussion: intention and content. It's not just about the notes, the rhythm, the instruments. It's about the message the music is sending, the purpose it serves.
Okay, so if I'm trying to figure out if a particular song is halal or haram, I need to look beyond the sound itself and really think about the meaning behind it, the intention. But how do you even do that? It seems kind of subjective.
Yeah, you got to use those critical thinking skills. Do some self-reflection. Ask yourself, what is this music about? What kind of values does it reflect? Does it make me think and feel things that are in line with my faith?
So it's not about blindly following rules. It's about engaging with music consciously and thoughtfully. I like that. It puts the responsibility on me to make good choices. But before we get too deep into the individual's role, maybe we should step back. Why is there so much debate about music in the first place? I mean, if Islam is all about clear guidelines, why is this so ambiguous?
That's a great point. It shows you how complex Islamic law is, how interpretation plays a huge role. The sources we have, the Quran and the Hadith, they give us principles, guidance, but they don't always lay down specific rules for everything.
So it's more like a framework than a rule book, right? There's room for interpretation for applying those principles to specific situations.
Yeah.
But that also means there's bound to be disagreements, different perspectives. So maybe this whole lack of clarity around music is actually a sign of how intellectually rich Islam is, how dynamic it is.
Exactly. And that's where the role of scholars comes in. They've spent their lives studying these sources, analyzing the evidence, and trying to provide interpretations that can help guide Muslims. But remember, even the most knowledgeable scholars can disagree.
And that's okay, right? Diversity of thought, that's a good thing. It means we have to engage with the sources ourselves, think for ourselves, and seek knowledge from people we trust. But before we unleash our listeners on the world of Islamic jurisprudence, maybe we should give them some practical tips. Some things they can actually use to navigate this musical minefield. What do you think?
Great idea. After all, we're not just having some theoretical debate here. We're talking about how Muslims live their lives, how they experience beauty, how they connect with their faith. So where does all this leave us? I mean, we've gone through a lot: Quran, Hadith, scholarly opinions. It's a lot to process. What can our listeners who love music actually take away from all this?
Right. Like at the end of the day, what are we supposed to do with all this information?
Well, I think it's helpful to remember the core arguments on both sides, right? So the strongest arguments against music, they really focus on a few things. Its potential to distract us from our religious obligations, its historical ties to things Islam moved away from, and of course those cautionary hadiths we talked about, the ones that paint a pretty stark picture.
Yeah, those were intense. But then on the flip side, we saw that there's no outright ban in the Quran itself. The Prophet, he allowed some forms of music and dance. Plus, we have all these respected scholars throughout history arguing that music can be okay, especially if it's got good content and the intention is pure.
Exactly. So really, it comes down to finding that balance, that middle ground, which, is a huge principle in Islam, wasatiyya, moderation. It's all about avoiding extremes, finding a path that works for our faith and our values.
So for someone out there who's passionate about music, does this mean they have to choose? Like their love of music versus their religious beliefs.
No, not at all. That's not what Islam is about. One of the most beautiful things about our faith is that it emphasizes personal responsibility and making informed choices. There's no one-size-fits-all answer here. Each person needs to weigh the evidence, consider their own situation, maybe even consult with a scholar they trust.
Okay, so no easy answers, but a call to really engage with this topic, think it through, and make choices that feel right. It definitely feels more empowering than just being told music is bad, end of story.
For sure. It's about understanding the principles, the different viewpoints, and then applying that knowledge to your own life. So if a certain type of music helps you feel closer to God, inspires you to do good, and isn't pulling you towards anything haram, then it could very well be permissible for you.
But if you're finding that certain music is making you skip your prayers, filling your head with bad thoughts, or glorifying stuff that goes against Islamic values, yeah, maybe it's time to step back and rethink things.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It comes down to being honest with yourself, knowing your strengths and weaknesses, and making choices that are in line with your commitment to living a good, God-conscious life.
This has been such an insightful conversation. As we wrap up, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that Islam is a religion of knowledge, critical thinking, seeking guidance. This whole journey of trying to understand where music fits in our lives, it's not about finding the answer, it's about the process of learning, reflecting, growing. And as you continue to explore this, just keep asking yourself, what role does music play in my life? How does it affect my relationship with God? What choices will help me live a life that is both meaningful and pleasing to Allah?
Beautifully put. And for everyone listening out there who's now feeling even more curious about this,